Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. Today I had on a friend of mine named Michael Kokal. Michael has his own podcast called the End of the Road podcast. It's a really good show, so if you haven't seen it, check it out. He recently interviewed me, and so we decided to have him on my show to talk about something a little bit different. He's actually a lawyer by trade, so we talked about the legality of this work, especially in the U.S., kind of some of the history of some of the drug laws and why they came about, and especially as a lot of these plants and medicines become more open, more legal in the U.S., he talked about some of the laws, the legality around that, and how he sees a path forward for a lot of these medicines. So I really enjoy talking to him, and I think you'll really enjoy this episode. As always, if you are listening on YouTube, or even if you're not, if you could go on YouTube and hit the subscribe button, that would really help. And also an Apple Podcast, that's kind of the biggest one. So if you're able to go on there, leave a starred rating and a short review, that would be a really big help. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and enjoy the show.
Awesome.
Cool. Well, welcome. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. This is, I think, a topic that's it's a really big thing, especially as this work becomes much more well known. It's really kind of spreading around the world, and one of the reasons a lot of people come down to these countries like Peru, Brazil, Colombia is because these plants, there's a really long history of working with them. And recently, I think it was maybe 10 or 20 years ago, a lot of these countries declared these medicines a national cultural heritage, essentially meaning that they have a really long lineage of being worked with by especially peoples of the Amazon, and that in essence they're a sacrament. Their lives, their culture are really built around these plants. So but kind of for better or for worse, a lot of the countries that we come from, we can't work with them because they're actually illegal. So I think the intention of this podcast is really, from what I know of you, you're a lawyer, and kind of going into some of the legality of why that's the case, and what are the precedences that have been set, and how that's also potentially now changing in the future.
Yeah. Well, first off, I guess my intention in this podcast is not to offer anybody legal advice. I mean,
Sure.
advice, the only advice I'm going to give them is don't listen to me. I just have this image of like what Jason's, what you could establish, here in the United States, and what that would look like in the future, because that's what I think, it'd be nice to see you establishing something up in this country. And that's kind of, what that would look like and how you would navigate that might be kind of an interesting thought experiment for us. But I'll go wherever you want to. But I'm not offering legal advice to anybody, please.
That's good. Well, we'll put that disclaimer in the beginning, just so everyone realizes that. I'll also put that in the show notes too, because that probably is an important thing. So maybe just to start, would you mind saying some of your background, maybe about your law background, and then also we met doing a podcast. So maybe you could, if you feel comfortable, talking a little bit about the podcast you run and what the intention behind that is as well.
Yeah, the podcast that I run has really nothing to do with sort of my law practice at all. I mean, my podcast is sort of my extension of sort of my own spiritual practices, which have really not found my way into the law practice yet. Yeah. So I've pretty much living a bifurcated life in that regard. But no,
which is also it's a really fascinating thing too, because I was just thinking about the history of the United States, and really a huge part of the history of the U.S. is people kind of fleeing religious persecution and the ability to come to this land and pursue their own spiritual practice.
Yeah, no doubt. That does, and some of the statutes, if you want to talk about, do preserve sincere religious practices, even when there are drug laws against them. For example, one of the cases, I don't know if you want to get into it, but there's a United States Supreme Court decision basically allowing an ayahuasca church, the UDV church, to practice, without regard to that, finding that it's a sincere expression of their religion. And even though there's another policy against using ayahuasca, which contains DMT, which is a Schedule I drug, that that they're going to create an exception on that, so that the church can exist. Or it's the First Amendment to the Constitution.
Right, and that's a really interesting thing, because I'm not sure how familiar you are, but are you familiar, or could you talk a little bit about maybe the history of drug illegalization? Because from my understanding, it really wasn't until the turn of the 20th century that really any substance became illegal. Kind of the idea behind the United States was not only religious freedom, but a freedom to live your life how you wanted, and any substance you ingested was your own choice, as long as you weren't harming someone else. And many of these plants or these drugs at the turn of the 20th century, they were legal. You could buy, for example, even Coca-Cola, for example. That name comes from two plants: coca, which is the coca leaf, and the cola nut. And many substances. Many presidents, the Pope. Many well-known figures were actively using these compounds for actually their medicinal value. And then at some point during the 20th century, kind of one by one, a lot of these substances became illegal.
Right. And each one of the substances seemed to have its own unique history and thread. But and we talked before about the 1970, the Controlled Substances Act that came through, and in the Nixon administration, kind of responding to all the perceived abuses of the counterculture and the drug culture in Vietnam, and civil rights, and there are a lot of motives that are attributed to that, but that's really a systematic federal legislation making a lot of at least the psychedelic drugs Schedule I substances, and and criminal. Although some of them had a history before then too, obviously, but that's probably the watershed statute, at least for federal legislation.
Yeah, there was a really good book. I don't know if you read it. It was by a guy named Johann Hari, and he wrote a book called Chasing the Scream. And it was kind of about the history of drug illegalization in the States. And from what I remember, and I did a little bit of research before this podcast, but it seems like the first substance that was made illegal was actually opium. And that actually happened, I think, towards the end of the 19th century. And that was the first one. And I believe it actually, opium itself didn't initially become illegal. But what the government did is, it was when a lot of Chinese immigrants were coming, and they had opium dens. And from what I understand, it seems like there was kind of two motives to making that illegal. So first, what they did is they made the opium dens illegal. They didn't specifically make opium illegal. And it seems like a lot of that was potentially some xenophobia or racism of trying to, there was also a time of kind of economic depression, and there's kind of the similar rhetoric of, these people are taking the jobs, and how do we get them out? And so one of the ways was to shut down the opium dens. And then also it seemed like there was kind of this fear mongering. You can go back and see where they were saying things like, all of our women, they're in these opium dens, and they're laying there naked, and the Chinese people are going to, abuse them. And so there's kind of this same fear propaganda. And it seems like then after they made the opium dens illegal, then opium at some point after was made illegal. And then I think the next one was actually alcohol during Prohibition. I think that was maybe 1913, something like that. And again, a lot of that same kind of fear mongering that alcohol is destroying society, and everyone's going to be lazy, and there was a lot of religious kind of pushback against alcohol as well. But like many of these things, I guess the question is, one, is that legal? And then two, if it is, are the consequences of that far worse than actually the substance itself? And certainly, as we saw from Prohibition, that was kind of the beginning of creating all sorts of crime, because when you make something illegal, you inherently create criminals, and that's how the mafia began, and crime and murders and all sorts of things really arose from that.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I think, and then, yeah, I guess after that was the marijuana. I think that was the next one. And a similar thing, a lot of Mexicans were using it, and there was a similar, I think, kind of pushback against Mexican immigrants, and that was one way that the government could kind of go after them, was to make marijuana illegal. And then I think also kind of in the South and a lot of the Black communities, jazz. There's a very famous story of Billie Holiday kind of being persecuted for that, and
Reefer Madness, the movie.
Right, Reefer Madness, yeah. And yeah, really a lot of propaganda against these things. And I mean, that's what's also interesting, because a lot of these substances are Schedule 1. And from my understanding, Schedule 1 essentially means there's no accepted medical value and a high probability of addiction.
Right.
And
which is probably the legacy of opium,
right.
which is addictive compared to what these other drugs are, which are not really been found to be addictive.
But it's interesting. I mean, because all of these, there's a very well-known medical use. Certainly now, as we're seeing for marijuana, I mean, cocaine is extremely medical. I mean, that's where even things like Novocaine came from. They're used medically in all sorts of ways. And certainly opium is used, opiates are used medically. I mean, really, that was kind of a miracle drug if you think about it, right? I mean, before, opiates came along, if you had surgery or something, you just bit a stick and took a swig of alcohol and kind of hope for the best. So,
yeah. Well, and I mean, that's, those are different. Some of those are different schedules because they recognize there is some inherent medical use, but the, the ones that, at least the psychedelics, they have found no medical use whatsoever. There's no redeemed features, and that probably, with the studies at Johns Hopkins and other places, being conducted by medical doctors, not Timothy Leary necessarily. There's an effort to probably reconceptualize the medical uses for psychedelic and probably get those definitions at least expanded or changed.
Right. Yeah. And that's something really fascinating with something like DMT, because, for example, that's why ayahuasca is illegal, because it contains DMT. But it also, by that definition, it almost seems antithetical to how something like ayahuasca or DMT is working, because obviously there's a tremendously high medical value, which can be seen all throughout, the Amazon, and how that's used to treat a whole host of medical ailments. And then the addictive part seems kind of counterintuitive as well, because as anyone who's worked with ayahuasca knows, for the most part, it's highly, highly not addictive. Usually it's the last thing you want to do. It's like the last resort, because there's potentially a world of pain coming.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, and it was kind of interesting. I was reading some articles on this. We were talking about medical uses of that psychedelics in some sort of treatment regimen could be could have established medical uses, or at least that's what I think the goal is. But a lot of the drugs that are on the market now that have, quote, medical uses really aren't to heal or to treat people. They're for, performance enhancement or to do, some other things. And, so that the whole category of what a medical use is pursuant to the Controlled Substances Act, it's kind of outdated. It was never defined under the act what a medical use is. I mean, it's not like they established some physician criteria for that, but I don't even think physicians would probably agree on what a medical use is versus, we're comparing like all different, the whole spectrum of things that people take into their body, is what's a medical use and what isn't, when they're all part of, they're all sort of interacting with us in different ways.
Right.
I mean, plants and in general, there's, I just think that whole category probably in the future will be more creatively. I mean, hopefully some legislature will have a more creative definition of that, which will permit, just what you're talking about, people to use these if they're so drawn to them, versus, drugs that, really don't, that the society says they have a medical use, but really they don't. I mean, not that they're not healing people.
Right. Is that that seems like maybe one of the big problems too, is how do we define these things? As one of the kind of early Western doctors, Hippocrates, said, let food be thy medicine. And I think, sometimes we kind of fall into these categories of defining things, of kind of reducing things to certain categories, like, food, for example. We think of food as one thing, but we don't realize that that's medicine too. Most food that we're putting in our body has medicinal qualities. That's one of the reasons we consume food, and certainly plants. I forget the exact statistics, but I think something like 70% of pharmaceutical medicine is plant derived. So even these categories, they're very gray, and even something like drugs, it often has a negative connotation, and yet, where I'm sitting here in Peru, there's a drugstore in almost every corner.
Yeah.
It's just it's somehow those are legal and certain ones aren't. So even the categorization of those seems very gray as well.
Oh yeah, and it's not defined, and if you look at these cases, the legal cases, they're all over the place, and then you have lawyers trying to butt into what doctors are considering a medical use, which really doesn't make sense. I mean, but then you have doctors, not necessarily understanding probably the indigenous uses of plants and how, and then you've got it's just like layers and layers of different policies and definitions and cultures all clashing. And I don't know. I would think that anything that grows in nature, it would seem to well, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how. I mean, it depends on where you want to get, I guess, as far as how you're going to define things. What you're going to exclude, is you will make the definition to exclude the plants or the drugs that you don't want to be widespread as a policy in
Right.
your culture.
And then it seems it gets even more complex because, as we were mentioning, DMT, which is found actually in many plants that we ingest all the time. And that's one of the fascinating things about ayahuasca is it's a combination of two plants. One of the plants contains DMT, but whenever we orally ingest something that contains DMT, there's an enzyme in our stomach that neutralizes that, so it doesn't have an effect. And the ayahuasca brew contains another plant that neutralizes that enzyme in our stomach, which then makes it active. But one of the fascinating things that kind of when I came to this work, I found really fascinating too, is that many of these alkaloids, such as DMT, they're also endogenous in the human being.
Sure.
We produce DMT. So, consuming something that contains DMT, I guess I could see how one could make that illegal, but essentially every human being is a walking illegal substance because we're producing those chemicals endogenously within our bodies.
Yeah. And probably if you go far enough, you could probably make that case for just about anything, that we're such
Right.
a conglomeration of different molecules that, we sort of contain everything. And so,
And that's another fascinating thing too, is we have these receptors already inside of ourselves. It's almost like this analogy of kind of, there's like a keyhole inside of us, and it's just waiting to be activated. And there's different ways of activating that. It doesn't just necessarily have to be through a plant. I mean, things like meditation or sleep or breath work, other things that we may consider in a spiritual tradition, those also activate those inherent receptors within us. So almost by that definition, you'd have to make something like meditation illegal or sleep illegal.
yeah. Yeah. Well, that would be interesting. That was a good point, because it's almost like there's a change happening in your body or in your consciousness, and the change can either happen through an action of your own, exercise or breath or something, or it can be in combination with something you take into your body, and it's all sort of the same in a way that yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I guess, a lot of what the research that you've done now is, because of this religious aspect, there's already been a few cases where some of these substances, such as ayahuasca, and I guess that's gone to the Supreme Court, it's been considered constitutional to be able to use those in a religious setting, because many of these plants, such as ayahuasca, there is a really long history of people using those in a religious context. For example, where I work in the Amazon, the Shipibo, for example, but many tribes, a lot of their culture and history is actually based around using these plants. It's a sacrament. It's a way of life. Their worldview is actually based on the consumption of various plants. So maybe, are you able to talk a bit about maybe how that came to arise, maybe with these cases of like UDV or Santo Daime, of how they were able to bypass the illegality of that and come to a place where they were able to work with it?
Yes, I kind of looked at some of the cases, and it's interesting. It's not that ayahuasca is constitutional. They did not make a constitutional argument. They made the argument that the state can't restrict it because of the Religious Freedom Restorations Act. So it's a statutory argument they were making, which is, I guess, is based upon the Constitution. But there was an other case, and that was based upon, there was a case in, which one was that? There was a case before that dealing with peyote, and it went up to the United States Supreme Court, where some indigenous Americans who took peyote were, I believe, fired from their jobs, and then they were denied unemployment benefits because the reason for the firing was the fact that they were taking peyote. And that actually sided with the government, and that they could deny unemployment benefits. And that was the first Supreme Court case. And then in response to that, I think then there was this Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which sort of changed that. So
were they denied because it was still federally illegal? Was that how they were able to justify that?
And it is still federally illegal. All these substances are Schedule I substances: peyote, ayahuasca, all the psychedelics. So they're all still illegal. It's just they're making an exception if it's part of a well-recognized, sincere religious practice under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Then the government has to show a compelling interest to restrict them. Mm-hmm. And in the ayahuasca case, the ayahuasca case is Gonzalez versus the UDV Church that came down in 2005. and that basically said that it was interesting. In that case, the government didn't even contest that the UDV church was part of a sincere religious belief. And so the only issue there was, did the government had a compelling interest in restricting the practice of and in there, it was like they seized ayahuasca coming into the country that was going to the UDV church. Mm-hmm. And then the UDV church sued, seeking a declaration that that was a violation of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act.
Huh.
The government then, they argued that let's see, I can find it. I can go to the case specifically and tell you what they argued, but basically, I think they were arguing that the U.S. had a treaty, an international treaty that required. There's a UN treaty basically making a lot of these psychedelic drugs illegal as well. So regardless of what happens in the United States, that would be the other sort of player involved. And it'd be interesting. Mm-hmm. I don't know if Peru is a member of that treaty or not, or signatory to that treaty. It wouldn't surprise me if they were, but like you said, there's another document where they've all agreed that this is part of their religious practice too. So maybe they're not signatories of that, but they also were concerned that if they had to restrict it because it would sort of spread to to other churches, and the court said that they really didn't prove that case. I mean, this was an existing church of 150 members, they said, in the United States, and it was a well-established, the government didn't contest that. So the at least on the injunction issue, that the Supreme Court sided with the UDV church on that.
And for those who aren't familiar, the UDV, I believe it's União de Vegetal. It's a Brazilian church who does. They work with ayahuasca as their sacrament. And it's also, it's a fascinating church, kind of like Santo Daime, in that it's really an amalgamation of many different cultures and traditions. I mean, Brazil is kind of like the US in that it's a land of immigrants. You had originally Portuguese, large African immigration, and then various immigrations from throughout Europe as well. And that church is using kind of the indigenous Amazonian ayahuasca, but then also, in essence, combining Christianity and African spiritism into it, and really creating a very unique religion.
Right. And I thought I think the Santo Daime Church was established in the 19th century, wasn't it? But the UDV is much more recent. I mean, it was, I think, it was the 1980s or something. It seems to be a lot smaller too.
Right. From what I know, Santo Daime is much older and much larger. I mean, really, they have churches all over Brazil. It's a pretty huge thing.
Yeah. And then I think I saw that there was another case specifically involving the Santo Daime Church in Oregon, not a Supreme Court case, but a federal trial court case that also allowed the Santo Daime to practice. And you're right, they specifically called it ayahuasca as a sacrament. So that's very important to establish the link to consumption of ayahuasca as part of a sacramental practice, as part of a religious ceremony. That really wasn't in too much of a doubt, as compared to other cases that I looked at where they there's a case dealing with cannabis that called the Church of Cognizance, and it was a case out west, not a Supreme Court case, a 10th Circuit court case. So that's it's the appellate court right below the U.S. Supreme Court. So it is still a court of appeals, but not the highest federal court of appeals in the land. And in that, they said they looked at sort of the motive of the practice, and they found that it was more of that the practitioner had more of an economic motive than a sincere religious belief. And it didn't help that I think he was selling marijuana to raise his bail money and things like that. I think it was part of, they had more marijuana than what they needed sort of for the religious practice. And so it had the, it struck the court as more of a sort of a business enterprise than as part of a religious tradition. So that's, if that's sort of what the court is looking at. Is it part of a sincere religious practice? And they'll look at, the economic motives behind it. They'll look at, how often, how the entheogen is used as part of the practice. And there seems to be a lot more support of ayahuasca, at least, that the court seemed to have, at least in the two that I've seen, both the Supreme Court case and the case dealing with the San Jaime Church in Oregon, there seemed to be a lot more of acceptance of ayahuasca as part of a sincere religious belief than marijuana, which for whatever reason has not had as, at least in the courts, as much of an acceptance as ayahuasca. And there are probably, a variety of reasons for that. But
now, with marijuana now, it seems, I haven't looked at it in a while, but I think probably now with a majority of states, it's legal, at least for medical use. And then it seems like there's a handful of states now where it's legal for recreational use as well.
Right. And that's a different issue. That's not, the federal law is still the same, but the state laws is changed. And that's kind of a different issue. We could talk about the decriminalization movements going on in Denver and other places, which is another twist on it. But still, the federal law is the same. It's almost like the state or the state saying, we're going to leave it to the feds to enforce this. But, since the federal government doesn't have really any policemen, that it's pretty much left, decriminalized if the state elects to decriminalize it. And
so if, from my understanding, how the United States was set up was obviously this idea that states had autonomy and that the federal government, their role was more for the nation as a whole, for international borders. So and I know this is an issue that's come up, like in Colorado, I think maybe it was the governor actually advised the sheriffs that if federal agents came in, that the sheriffs actually had the right to interfere with the federal agents' dictum, because on a federal level it's illegal, but on the state level it's legal. So are you familiar with the legality of that? I mean, does a state have the ability to supersede on that federal mandate?
Well, it depends on the circumstances. There's been a long history of that. You can imagine, the civil rights era in the United States. You just had that scenario you had played out. That was actually played out in the civil rights era, because you had federal agents under the Kennedy administration, wanting to implement school desegregation, and then you had the local law enforcement, very much against that. And generally speaking, there's exceptions to everything, but if the federal government wanted to enforce something, my money would probably be on the feds under most circumstances. But I guess it just depends. You're exactly right. But if a governor, I can't imagine, well, this country, I don't think maybe you can tell me, I don't remember any historical president where the, local sheriffs are interfering with the feds. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I just can't think of any. But I think it's just more that the federal government doesn't have the resources to do the enforcement. In a lot of this, that's it's. You're right. It's a state right issue, and the states. But still, if it would come to, if it comes to pass and the federal government there's some state, the Civil War. This country has always had the counterbalance between the state interests and the federal government, but the federal government usually comes out provided that there's that is the federal policy.
It seems like in the case of the Civil War or the civil rights movement, that the role of the federal government would be to uphold individual rights. And if a state isn't doing that, then I could understand where they come in and mandate that. But if a state, it seems like if a state is upholding the individual right of someone to use a substance if they choose to, I don't see how the federal government could overrule that, because in essence, then they would be going against their function, which is to uphold an individual's right.
Yeah, that would be, I mean, that would be the argument, definitely. It'd be interesting to see what would, how that would work through the court system on that, if it would work through the court system. Yeah. I haven't been, I'm assuming that this scenario where there's a sort of a clash between the federal and state, has that occurred in Colorado? I guess I wasn't aware that it was, but maybe
not that I know of. I just remember reading, and I could be wrong, but that the governor did give the authority of the sheriffs, if the federal agents were to go in, that they could arrest the federal agents, or they could stop. I guess they wouldn't arrest them, but they could somehow stop them from doing what they were going to do. I don't think it ever came to that, but
yeah.
It at least seemed like a pretty bold move to even say that. Yeah. Well, so maybe going back to the UDV and Santo Daime. So those two cases both went to the Supreme Court?
No, only the UDV did.
Okay.
And the Santo Daime Church was a case in the federal trial court in Oregon.
Okay.
I believe that was an Oregon case.
So do you know, has the federal government tried to infringe at all post those two rulings and into either UDV or Santo Daime?
I haven't heard, but I'm not a member of either of those churches, and I'm not on their mailing list or how they would do that. I get the feeling not. Given that there's so many places here in this country where ayahuasca is done outside of a church, I don't know. You always see, it's even advertised on Facebook, shaman coming to the United States to offer this or that ceremony, or even not coming to the United States, somebody already here. I mean, if the federal government wanted to start enforcing it, it wouldn't be hard to sort of follow the breadcrumbs, so to speak. So, yeah. But I think that, that's the point, that it might be somewhat dangerous to think that you have a constitutional right to ayahuasca, because those cases that we talked about are specifically ayahuasca being used as a sacrament in sort of established churches, not. Again, there's a lot of alleged crimes that do not get enforced, and there's, just because of whatever reason, there's no policy on this. But I just, if the federal government wanted to enforce ayahuasca, people taking ayahuasca, these cases might not be much of a defense unless the use of ayahuasca was done under the auspices of some sort of church or recognized religious ceremony. And the fact that it would be interesting to see, because the participants can say, well, we have a sincere belief, and we're using this as a religious practice, but the container that they're in is not a recognized religious vehicle, so to speak, like the UDV Church or Santo Daime. I don't think that issue has been litigated yet. So, you probably would not want to be the test case necessarily.
So then I guess it seems it's kind of a catch-22. One potentially wouldn't be able to start a church from within the U.S. because in order to have a church, it has to have a pre-existing history. And if something is illegal, you couldn't have that history. So would it necessarily have to come from the outside, from some tradition that has a history, to then be legalized within the U.S.?
Well, I think it would obviously help. I think that there's a prejudice in the United States against sort of startup churches to begin with. So that would be, the government would say, I'm just making, let's just play devil's argument. The government would say, well, you know, the argument would be that, okay, we've got a Schedule I substance, you know, ayahuasca, the DMTs contain it. We don't, our public policy is we don't want to limit that. We don't want that to spread and corrupt the youth or whatever, you know, whatever the rhetoric would be. In the UDV case and the Sandy Daime case, it was already a well-established church, as you pointed out. People were already there. And so the courts have said, well, there's not really a danger of it spreading much because it's already an established church. But if you have a startup church, and then there would be a stronger argument that the government would have a compelling interest to regulate that or to enforce it, as opposed to a well-established church. So that's a good point. So I guess back to, you know, my imaginary church that you're going to be involved with, you know, if you were establishing something, you could call it like the Temple of the Way of Life North, or and then that would, you could probably imagine that would have an easier time than a startup church where somebody doesn't have any history doing it. But you know, that issue hasn't been litigated yet.
Right.
And as you point out, I mean, we can imagine scenarios that, for example, you yourself, I mean, I don't think anybody that knows you would doubt that you have a sincere religious practice in the various entheogens and plant medicines that you partake in. I mean, that's been your life for a decade, or, you know, however long it's been. You know, you've been down in Peru. So if you went down there and then came to the United States, then, well, you could say that you have a, you know, your practice is sincere, obviously. And then it would probably cut against you a little bit, the fact that you're probably might be getting new converts, so to speak. But, you know, I just would think that, I mean, that would be the argument. I mean, that would be the policy that the court would look at. And then they would say, you know, are these people, you know, they would look at your motivation. You know, are you here just for the money? Did you establish a not-for-profit group? Does it look like a church? I mean, you'd want to establish something that looked like a Christian church, you know, I mean, or a church, you know, any church that has sort of a, it's not a profit-seeking thing. It's like trying to help people. These court cases look at how much they charge for the ceremonies. You know, if you're there trying to help people, or you're just trying to charge exorbitant fees to get money. These would all be the factors that you know would come into play, because you'd want them to look at more like a church, because that's what the law is protecting. You know, it's the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and they're protecting a church, a well-established church. So the extent you look like a church, it would be, you know, it would make sense that would have a more degree of protection than, you know, something that doesn't look like a church for whatever reason.
Does that kind of make it a bit more complicated too, in that churches are exempt from many taxes? That
Yeah. Well, you would want to get it tax exempt, because, you know, if you applied for your organization, let's just call it Temple of the Way of Life North, or I'm just teasing you. If you call it Temple of the Way of Life North, you would want to get tax exempt status, I would assume, so that, you know, if you purchased a building or did something, you know, all that, you would have certain benefits of that. And then if you got tax exempt status, then you would be dealing with the IRS, and the IRS, when you applied for that status, you'd have to put, well, what's your purpose? And your purpose would be, you know, you would have a religious purpose, and, you know, would just look more like what churches do. I mean, that's what churches do. And so to the extent you make it look more like a church, that would probably be the better way to go, as opposed to, I'm just imagining something else that doesn't look like a church, at least for this.
I mean, it seems like something even like UDV, you were mentioning this idea that they already have, whatever it was, 150 members, and that probably it's not going to spread. But inherently, isn't the idea of any church that new members will come. And I mean,
Yes.
even something like word of mouth. I mean, if the church is good, you would think it would expand, right?
Right. No, and that's exactly right. That's the argument against that. And you
Mm.
just got to imagine, who the judge is that's going to decide, the judge or the jury. The one thing is that you don't, I mean, if the person was against ayahuasca and wasn't sort of familiar with it and wasn't, did not think that it was, had a significant medical use, so to say, to go back to our other conversation, you might have some reluctance to some organization that came and was advertising, trying to proselytize new members and trying to get them all to take this illegal one substance. Alleged, so that's just something to think about. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that would be, churches have a long history of, especially in where you live now, of proselytizing and trying to change beliefs and get more converts. So that's the argument against it. That so you would probably be advised to do it sort of, as my daughters would say, be chill about it and not advertise all over the internet, for example.
So do you think some of this is just kind of the perception? I mean, when we think about something like heroin, there's this perception that it's people on the street shooting up and they have no life, and obviously it's destroyed their life, even though that's probably not true. But and then looking at something like Santodaime or UDV, I mean, most of the people, I would imagine almost all of them are upstanding citizens. They come from middle or upper class backgrounds. They're doctors, lawyers, scientists, policymakers, musicians. So the kind of the perception that these are good people doing good work versus kind of delinquents and the undercurrent of the bad society is the perception a big thing.
And that shouldn't come into play, because even if it's a church not dealing with the doctors and lawyers and stuff, but a different demographic, you would still want to protect them. Mm-hmm. But, given the way that society works, that doesn't hurt. If you would have witnesses coming in to testify that you have a sincere religious practice and that this church doesn't have deleterious effects, you would get the people from Johns Hopkins coming in and testifying for you, or, somebody with an MD or a PhD after their name, saying that, oh, well, this has both spiritual elements and it's non-addictive, and it has helped people with, XYZ. Mm-hmm. It does have medical usage too.
Right.
But I think that, but I think, going back to your point, the actual test should not be based upon, I can imagine a church that is composed of people that are, homeless or something, and that it's providing something for them, and that, that should be, it's the sincerity, I think, of the religious belief and the practice itself that I think is important.
So a lot. So, for example, with LSD, I'm a huge fan and proponent of Western medicine. It has amazing benefits. I mean, certainly, if I was to break a leg or be in a car accident, I would want to go straight to a hospital and, get antibiotics and have them clean the wound and set the bones. And but certainly for some things, Western medicine seems to not be living up to potentially the expectation. And I think a lot of that has to do with things that we would consider mental emotional disorders, anxiety, depression, sense of life's purpose, things like that. And really with psychology, I guess in the 60s and 70s, when LSD was created, there was a tremendous hope, and many psychologists, psychiatrists, people in the medical field were really raving about the therapeutic benefits that they were able to work with their patients much better, because that substance actually, in a sense, opened them up and allowed them to work through many of these things, the traumas or the doubts, the anxieties, the fears. Um, so with that, how did it get to a point where it seemed like there was a lot of scientific or medical substantiation as to the benefits of it, to something like that then becoming illegal?
Yeah. Well, I think from what I've read, it seemed to be that Timothy Leary was in some ways demonized for pushing it too far too fast. And Timothy Leary did not have an MD after his name, but he was giving quote unquote drugs to a bunch of people, trying to cure them. And then the other thing, there were a lot of things going on in the late '60s that led to this, the illegality of LSD. You had the countercultural movement, you had the Manson murders, you had Altamont. There were just a lot of the riots and the fires in various cities in the United States. People were afraid, and then Nixon promised law and order, and we were going to Vietnam War. The Vietnam protests had a lot of this too, and they were all linked to to psychedelics, fairly or unfairly. And so I think my perception is that it just went too far too fast, and people got a little leery of it. And then there were some bad examples with Charles Manson that just scared people, and things like that. And then Leary saying he's going to put it in the water, and we can put it in the water. And but I guess MK Ultra was doing that in the 50s. They were dousing their own scientists. So it's kind of like the Wild West, with this stuff. Nobody really understood what they were doing, and when with that comes misinformation and fear. And then go ahead.
Oh yeah. Well, I was just thinking, within the last decade or so, there seems to be a real resurgence of actual scientific medical workings with a number of these substances, like psilocybin, which is the active alkaloid in some mushrooms, things like MDMA. How did it go from being illegal, Schedule 1, to many of these really well-known universities like Johns Hopkins having the ability to then use those in a medical setting?
I think they have worked through the system, through the FDA and other things. I mean, I think Rick Doblin is. I mean, he's. I think he has a master's degree in public policy from Harvard, or one of them does. I mean, so they're doing this all working within the system. Which, granted, as going back to your point that there's a lot that Western medicine doesn't understand about this, and a lot of the indigenous beliefs are important too. But at least working through this in the United States, it's good that you have somebody sort of leading the charge that is that savvy about public policy and trying to work within the system, as compared to what we had in the 60s with, quote about Timothy Leary, for example, not working within the system, but trying to push the system from the outside. He was, tune in, drop out, that kind of thing. And here we've got, people very consciously working within the system to get fast track authority within the FDA to get all that. And that's probably the way to go this time, since it was such a failure last time,
Right.
because as you pointed out, there was, I think I've heard that there's so many studies of all the positive effects of psychedelics in the 60s that sort of went neglected for 20 years, and the state of medicine just stagnated because he couldn't do any research in it. So,
Mm-hmm.
who knows by now, had that research continued, maybe, that it would be, and I guess in the, what I've got in the back of my mind is sort of the pharmaceutical drug industry with all the antidepressants and things. I can't imagine those are good for our society, at so many levels. And so I guess my hope is that our society can find a new path, and that this perhaps leads, to a better path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know how much research has been done in the States, but for example, with ayahuasca, there's a lot of research in Brazil and I think also in Spain, and showing in ayahuasca, often DMT is the alkaloid that's most talked about, but you have a number of different alkaloids, like the harm alkaloids, and those really seem to be shown to be anti-anxiety, anti-depression, and often the effects last weeks, sometimes much more, even at relatively small doses, much more effective than our pharmaceutical antidepressants. Definitely with psilocybin, the work at Johns Hopkins, they were doing it with people on who had terminal conditions where essentially they were going to die, and often with that there's a lot of fear that comes along with that, a fear of death, a fear of losing their families, of leaving their family in a desperate situation. And the results really seemed astronomical. I mean, kind of staggering, of people describing it as one of the more, if not the most profound experience they ever had, of really alleviating those symptoms of the fear of death, of the fear of leaving their families. And the results just seem to far exceed anything we're using pharmacologically previous to that. So do you think, with this idea of Schedule 1, again, meaning that there's no medical value and a high probability of addiction, it seems like what a lot of these plants are doing is quite the opposite. And it seems like more and more they're showing that there's a very high medical value and a very low probability of addiction. So do you think it's just really, the more this research is done, the more those policies will begin to change?
Certainly. Yeah, no question about that. And it was kind of interesting that one of the John Hopkins studies dealing with PTSD was done on veterans. So, that's just almost brilliant, because that would be, our society has a definite need to address, that's a real problem, especially, and veterans are very sympathetic. Everybody wants to help out veterans. So to target your research to help out, like, as you point out, end of life care in veterans is a real sensitivity to a study that can have real demonstrative effects. It would be interesting to see, though, what do you think, sort of assuming that there is sort of widespread adoption of psychedelics in the treatment of these conditions by Western medical professionals, is something, do you think, given your experience down in Peru, is something lost when you have sort of a Western medical container for this versus the indigenous practice, or does the indigenous practice perhaps connect with sort of the spiritual aspect of this that maybe is neglected by the Western practice, or maybe not honored as much?
I think both. I did a podcast recently with a guy I work with, and he's a psychotherapist. He does a lot of work with cognitive behavioral therapy. And we were talking a bit about that. And I think, kind of like you said, with what happened with LSD, obviously a lot of these substances are very regulated, and that's the way of it right now. And so, as you were saying, the way to move forward is probably more in a clinical setting, to have who we view, for example, in a lot of Western societies, as the authority, that the doctors, the scientists, actually showing or proving that these are medicinal, and that the chance of addiction is very small. So I think that's probably just going to be the way of it, and maybe as the restrictions ease, then that will potentially open up paths for people to work with it outside of those clinical settings. It's interesting. Maybe you're familiar with R. Gordon Wasson. He was I think he was the head of J.P. Morgan. Very wealthy guy, very straight-laced guy. And he got really interested in psilocybin mushrooms, and he went down to Mexico, and he worked with Maria Sabina, who was the Mexican curandera who worked and he treated people with mushrooms. And eventually psilocybin was isolated, and he brought psilocybin pills to her, and he asked her to take them. And at first it seemed like she wasn't that impressed, but as she worked with him, according to R. Gordon Wasson, she eventually said that it has the same spirit. In her language, they view these things in more of a spiritual term. And she said that the psilocybin had the same spirit as the mushrooms as a whole. Now, it seems like potentially later in her life that changed a bit, but that also could have been from outside circumstances. She was heavily criticized by her village for kind of opening up that tradition to outside people, and her life became very difficult. So that could have influenced it too. I really don't know. Certainly, it's like anything. If we take a vitamin, for example, right now with the coronavirus, it's being shown that zinc is very effective at treating the coronavirus. But if we take zinc by itself, it's very difficult for the body to fully metabolize that, to accept that, for it to be absorbed into the body. So often you need something else. And that's some of the thought behind hydroxychloroquine, is that it actually acts as a medium for transporting the zinc into the body. Food or plants in their natural form, they're much more assimilable into the body. And we know that. That's why, for example, Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine, because, food, taking something in its natural form, is superior for the most part. And that's not the case with 100% of things. But I think it's very similar with these plants. I think often from our more Western mindset, we tend to reduce things to certain alkaloids or chemicals. For example, in ayahuasca, we speak about DMT, and certainly DMT is one of the more powerful alkaloids in that brew, but there's many different alkaloids, like the harm alkaloids, and those have tremendous benefits too. And I'm sure there's all sorts of alkaloids that we just haven't even isolated yet that also have effects. So if one is just working with DMT, I think there's a benefit to that, but it's also, we're not getting everything in its full spectrum. And that's just the actual substance itself. As you said, with most of these plants, there's a tradition around it. There's a spiritual tradition around it. And those things are very powerful. For example, working with the Shipibo with ayahuasca, they would never just kind of give someone ayahuasca and then walk away. There's a whole ritual around that. Their main way of working is something called an icaro, and it's a song. And they actually sing to the patient. And through that song, they would say they're transmuting something or activating the medicine. And that may seem very strange to people who haven't done that before. But from my experience, there's truly something to that. I also had the opportunity to work with Iboga at one point, and that's a very, very powerful medicine. There's a lot of research now with Ibogaine, which is the active alkaloid, in treating really severe addictions, especially opiate addictions, and having tremendous success. But one thing I really realized, and I was talking to this about Sean, is a big part of that tradition when you work with Iboga is also the music, the song, the instruments. And I very much felt that was a huge part of the work. The music is very repetitive and very looping. And it was very interesting because when I worked with it, the guy who's running the ceremony, he gave kind of a prep talk. And, I was expecting all of this, hopefully amazing insights and recommendations. And his only advice was, if you get stuck in a loop, shake your rattle. And they give you this little plant rattle to shake. And I was just thinking like Jesus, that's your only advice for me. But I very much saw, after under the influence of that, the importance of that, because what I took from it was the music was actually putting people in a state of this looping mechanism, which for me is actually the root of all addiction. And I think a lot of us, we tend to look at addiction as a substance. We're addicted to a substance. But I think there's been a tremendous amount of research, and Johan Hari talks about this in his book. Also, at the Temple of the Way of Light, we work with Gabor Mate, who's become very well known in this field of working with addiction. And this idea that we've kind of been taught is actually very unscientific, that a substance itself is addictive. And I think what a lot of the more modern research is showing is that it's not the substance that's addictive. It's the human mind that's addictive. The state of the human mind is a state of addiction. And it doesn't have to be to a substance. Many of us were addicted to all sorts of things, to our work, to sex, could be to drugs, stimuli now. I mean, our cell phones are amazingly addictive. There's dopamine releases every time you get a like on Facebook or, a follow on Instagram. And these things can become very addictive. But it's not the thing itself. It's the relationship we have to something. And I think that's something really powerful that the Gabor Mate has really done a lot of research in, is that, essentially all addiction comes from some sort of trauma, that essentially there's something in us that's not happy. And from a holistic point of view, that's what disease is. Even our word for disease, it means dis-ease. It means we're not at ease. And so when we're not at ease, we look to something to seemingly bring us back into a state of ease. And that can be any number of things. Unfortunately, with addiction, if that thing isn't actually getting to the root of the problem and it's just curing the symptom, then we keep going back to that. And through that, an addiction is formed. And the problem with most addictions is that it's not getting to the root, and we're having to go back to it. And often we become kind of acclimatized to it, and then we need more, and we need it with more frequency just to get to that same state. So my point kind of with that was that, with something like Iboga, what I saw was the music was a fundamental part of that, because it was essentially putting the mind in that state of addiction and showing the person who's working with Iboga the actual addictive mechanism of the mind, and not only seeing all of our own addictions, which originate from the mind, all of the beliefs we have, the patterns, the judgment, the traumas, the fears, but showing how that mechanism works. And it's interesting because with Iboga, you do two ceremonies, and the first ceremony is called the death ceremony. And essentially what that's doing is taking you into that process. And it's often a very difficult process, because we see all of our own shit. We see how the mind is working. And for me, it was fascinating. Even many of these things that I thought I had resolved, I saw they're still somehow running in the background there. They may not be super strong, but they're still there, just running in these loops, these constant loops. And the second Iboga ceremony is called the rebirth ceremony. And it's essentially finding a way out of that, seeing how to break those cycles. And even a lot of the research into these plants, like ayahuasca, one of the main things they're showing is this idea of neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, which is actually creating new pathways, which is, again, antithetical to addiction. It's taking us into the addiction, and then it's showing us, oh, there's a way out. And actually looking in the brain, we see that new pathways are created, new possibilities are opened. So from my experience with working with these traditions, nobody does these things for no reason. You don't have rites and rituals and all of these things just for the hell of it. There's a very specific reason all of these things were created, and they were created to aid in that process, to really allow the plant or the drug that's being ingested to work in its maximum level. So kind of a long answer, but yes, there's a danger in taking things out of context, but at the same time, there's still a benefit because we still are working with some alkaloid that does have a benefit. And so it may be, again, that's the way that things just unfold, is we have to put it in the clinical setting to say from an authoritative place, this works. And then hopefully we begin to see through more research that there actually is benefit to all of these traditions, and all of these things have a value, and actually can not only expedite the work, but augment it, make it that much more effective. And it's something I've seen, even something like DMT, it can be taken just by itself. There are people who smoke DMT and they have profound experiences. From my experience, and this could be, some judgment on my part, but from my experience, when people work with things that way, the results, they tend not to last, or they tend not to have the same impact as when someone works with something in a more holistic way, in a more traditional way. From what I've seen, the insights really tend to stick. And again, it's not always, light and beauty and, oh my God, this is amazing. Sometimes it's really difficult. And, people take some time to integrate that, but there tends to be, I think, a much more lasting change. So, yeah.
I was wondering, the resistance of cultures to embrace psychedelics, and it's been kind of throughout history, at least in Western societies, and I think in Eastern societies, except, maybe not in the Amazonian jungle. But have you ever given any thought to what you think is actually behind that? I mean, these psychedelics, what are they opening up that our society is resisting? And is something opening up sort of antithetical to notions of human progress in sort of the Western sense? I'm thinking about, I think I mentioned, in some of my email correspondence to you about, how does Elon Musk, does just something about sort of the Western look of human progress and how that is in relationship to sort of these psychedelics. And there's parts of me that sort of is resistant to that, because I think the progress that Western society has led to sort of more freedoms than might be existing in sort of a tribal setting that's kind of tightly controlled by authoritarian structures. And there is somewhat of a fear to me that psychedelics might, if used in the wrong hands, be used to support authoritarian structures, or that was what was thought. But what is, or is it rather the other way, that's the resistance that we need to transcend, and that's just part of the process of the gradual evolution of humanity into some sort of higher state of being that doesn't have all this baggage about, all our separation and fragmentation and all the beliefs we have. What
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably,
There's a lot to unpack there. Well, I mean, certainly it's something I find fascinating, because I think a lot of times when people come down to do this work, there can often be maybe a fetishizing of certain indigenous cultures. And, certainly I'm not someone who's against Western culture. In fact, much like you said, I think, Western culture has given people the most economic freedom, religious freedom, personal freedom, really increasing the standard of life in so many ways. And, but like with everything, almost like a pendulum, it kind of can go back and forth. And as we advance in certain ways, we may become more disconnected in other ways. and with a lot of the freedom we experience in the West, it's an amazing thing, but there can be drawbacks to that too. And that's something I really see with people coming to do this work is you're free to do anything. What do you want to do? What kind of job do you want to do? And that's an amazing thing, especially in the States. There's no other country that offers people that type of prosperity. I mean, someone literally can come to the US like Arnold Schwarzenegger. and there's a funny Bill Burr sketch about that. Become famous for lifting weights, become Mr. Olympia, become the governor of California, marry into a royal family. There's no other country that offers that. So that's an amazing thing. But what I do see from a lot of people coming down, which is with that opportunity and openness, sometimes there can be a drawback with that as well, as people feel really lost. In many of these indigenous societies, people are born into a certain role, and that's your life. That's who you are. And obviously that can be kind of devastating in a way that if that's not what you want to do, well, too bad, that's what you do. But there's also, in a sense, a comfort of that, of, well, this is who I am. And that's how a lot of cultures used to be. I mean, even, our names often come from that. John Smith, John was the blacksmith, and that's what you did. You were born into that family, and that's who you're going to be. Conversely, in many, I think, indigenous societies, I think they were actually much more open than maybe we think. I think, from my kind of understanding and research, even something like the chief or the tribal leader, that was more of a Western invention. When Western people came and said, we need to speak to your leader, they kind of looked at them like, what are you talking about? We don't have a leader. Everyone's free to do whatever they want. There's a really good book called Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. And it was this Christian missionary who went down to this group of people in Brazil called the Pinaha. And kind of a long story short, but eventually he gave up Christianity and kind of adopted their beliefs because he realized they were actually much more free than he was. And it was kind of this idea of, he gives this example of someone's house fell down and everyone started laughing. They thought it was hilarious. If where we come from, if our house is destroyed by a fire or something, it's devastating. What are we going to do? That's our lives. But in this tribe, if someone's house was destroyed, everyone just kind of rolled up their sleeves and they all built a new one. But there wasn't a chief telling them, you have to do this. It's just, if you're living in a society, that's what you're going to want to do, because it's much easier to everyone comes together and builds that house. And then if my house falls down, well, everyone's going to come and do that. But there was never someone saying you have to do that. There was no regulation or chief saying, if you don't do this, there's repercussions for that. Also, I think the more I do this work, and this is obviously controversial, and I'm not saying this is true, but from my sense, the essence of all religion and all spirituality was this type of work. It may have been with plants, it may not have, but that essentially, especially this plant work, was connecting people to something that they didn't have access to in their normal day-to-day lives. And we see this in everything. I mean, Moses, he was given the 10 Commandments under the influence of burning acacia bushes, which also contained DMT. But, even this idea, we look at Moses as if he was some chosen figure, but essentially in a more indigenous point of view, anyone has access to that. If you go into your own spirituality, you have access to the 10 Commandments. You have access to God or a higher form of consciousness, which is telling us, again, and we kind of talked about this in the podcast I did with you, these really simple things like, the golden rule, treat people as you want to be treated, treat your neighbor with respect, don't kill people, be nice to people. Why is that? It's not for the other person, it's for you, because that's how I find happiness. If I'm living in that way, then I can be happy. And I think that's what all of these traditions are pointing to. And it was this in the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, what was written as you walked in, know thyself. And I think all of these traditions are pointing to that, know thyself. And how do I do that? I have to go in and I have to have access to that. And I think these plants give us a way to do that. Um, and all over the world, I mean, the Vedic tradition, which is probably the oldest living tradition, they talk about things like soma, which was some substance that people took, and they were able to communicate with God, and that's where this religious tradition came from. You see that in Zoroastrianism; it was the exact same thing. It was hauma, which is linguistically the same thing. It was very controversial, but there was some thought. Even I don't know if you've heard of John Allegro. He wrote this book called "The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross," and he was hired to translate. I think it was the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Qumran Scrolls. And he was a very straight-laced scholar, a linguist, and after spending years translating these things, he came to the conclusion that the early Christians were essentially a mushroom and fertility cult, and that their sacrament was a mushroom, and that's how they had revelation. That's how they experienced Christ consciousness. Even if that's not true, certainly, a lot of the early Christian cults or pagan cults had these rituals, the Elysian rites, or all of these things, the Dionysian rites, and I think there's a remnant of those things today. Things like the Freemasons and all of these mystery schools, and even the Egyptian or the Greek schools. They came from the Egyptians, and I mean, why were the pyramids built? We still have no idea, but most likely there was some religious connotation to them. So, yeah, again, long story short, but I think this work is somehow at the essence of all of these things. And much like I mentioned to you in that the podcast we did, this study that came out, which again, we have to be somewhat weary of studies, but showing that working with these plants, it really begins to change people kind of to this anti-authoritarian view, which you were mentioning. So it's the opposite. It's empowering people. It's showing people know thyself. It's making people dependent and dependent while at the same time realizing their interdependence amongst all things. And I think with that arises this real sense of compassion and understanding and connection, and treating people like you want to be treated. So yeah, I think to answer your question, in the West, I think it's probably a natural progression, potentially, in order to, really have this reductionist way of thinking, of really specializing in all of these things, which allows, all of these amazing things to emerge, something like our iPhone or something. The only way that happens is really specializing in all of these things and kind of having this, single track mind of going into these things. But I think at the same time, it's really important that, even with the iPhone, with all of these specialized people working on something, there's still, in a sense, a visionary, someone like Steve Jobs, who's looking at something in a more holistic way and saying, this is what we want to work towards. And I think, maybe to finally answer your question, maybe what we're missing in the West is a more holistic way of looking at things. And sometimes we get so focused, and I think we're seeing it politically right now, we get so focused in these details that it's difficult to step back and look at things in a more holistic picture, to put things in relation to other things, to see not only the bad, but to see the good too. And these ideas of wisdom, of really seeing things in a holistic way. So, I think, and much like you were saying with LSD kind of being a product of that time, that also seems to a large degree what it was doing. It was making people question these authorities and the wars. Why are we going to fight? As I think Muhammad Ali really famously said, why do I want to go kill these people who haven't done anything to me? They're also just people. So I think it's interesting that in this time, this work with plants is really expanding, and I think there's probably a symbiosis happening where, because of where we're at as societies, we actually really need these plants, and they are helping probably to start to bring things back into a balance.
Yeah.
That was probably a long answer, but
No. That's exactly. And why do you think plants have been kept secret? Or you mentioned, different esoteric practices. It's almost like Soma. Soma is kept secret and was never clear what it was. And, the different esoteric practices, the magical practices, everything's secret. And now with the internet, well, who knows, but there, everything can be shared and there are no secrets. So what's the upshot of all the secret practices and the restricted drugs and if religion does have a basis in plant medicine, as you alluded to, and which I, agree with too, why was that kept secret, for so many years? Was it just to enforce a power structure that, I'm just, we don't have to.
I mean, I think probably a multitude of reasons. I mean, certainly for most of human history, we've been warfaring, conquering, and that's what happened here in the Amazon too. Is one of the main ways that you conquer people is to divide them. Divide and conquer. You kill the religious leaders. You demonize them. You say they're practicing witchcraft, and in that way you slowly convert people to how you think. So I think that's a lot of that. And that's not just a Western phenomenon. I mean, in the Amazon, they do that. There's a long history of warfare and witchcraft and demonizing the healer from the other tribe, that he's actually the bad guy and we have to go kill him. So it's a universal thing. It happens all over the world. I do think there's probably a power aspect to that too. When probably that's to some degree what happened with LSD in the 60s and 70s, is it was seen as a threat to certain power structures. If everyone's protesting war, and we know war is how the federal government can increase its power and increase its control, if all of a sudden this plant or this medicine is making people question that's a direct threat to the state. And then also, a lot of these medicines are very strong. They're very powerful, and they do need to be worked with caution and care and in a tradition. And that's something I respect a lot with, we were talking about Santo Daime, is that one of the precepts that they have is that there is no kind of evangelical aspect of that. You actually can't go and try and convert someone and bring them to the church. That person has to come to the church on their own accord. They have to express a desire to really work with that. And I think that's a really profound principle to have. And so I think a lot of these secret societies, they're not necessarily trying to keep themselves secret. It's just you have to come to a place in your life where you feel that calling. Now, I think it also, as we were talking about the last podcast, that this sense of, we were talking about ayahuasca, how many people relate this thing that ayahuasca actually called them. They felt a call to work with it. And so I think with many of these medicine paths, there does need to be that call. It's something working at the Temple of the Way of Light, we talk to people a lot about in our final integration talk. Often with something like ayahuasca, people have these amazing experiences, life-changing experiences, and there's this natural inclination to go out there and then be evangelical. You have to take ayahuasca; it's going to change your life. I discovered this amazing thing, but that never works. That tends to draw people away. And ultimately, if I'm telling you need to work with ayahuasca and you don't really want to work with it, and you start to work with it, you're going to run out of the ceremony on day one. You're going to be like, what the fuck is going on? This is not for me. This is not what I signed up for. So I think people really have to come to a place in their life where they want to do that. And that desire has to be very deep and very profound. There's a really beautiful quote in the Gospel of Thomas where he says, in order to something like, in order to find, you must seek. But when you seek, at first you're going to be terrified. But after being terrified, you'll stand in awe. And so I think that's a really natural progression. You know, this work is very difficult, and one has to want to do it. And so again, I don't think it's inherently being kept secret. It's just, it's not pushed out there. So, you know, people really have to find it on their own accord. Um, so that's kind of my thoughts. But again, I'm sure there's, you know, there's many reasons. And probably a lot is, as we see in Western culture, you know, sometimes we just tend to get away from things. We tend to forget the value of certain things. We forget the value of maybe what these plants are opening us to. We forget about the importance of going out into nature, of cooking home cooked meals. You know, we instead we eat fast food, and it makes sense. You know, oh well, if I eat fast food, I have more time to do other things. But eventually we realize there's a downside to that. We potentially can suffer from that too. And then we have to come back to tradition. We have to come back and realize the value of some of these things. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that?
No, I agree with what you're saying.
So do you think, I mean, it seems like, for example, with marijuana, I mean, there obviously was a lot of propaganda against that, saying that there was no medical value, saying that there was very high rates of addiction. I mean, it seems like the mentality of most people in the US, it seems like most people realize now there definitely is a medical value. And it seems like there's a very big push to not only have it legal for medicinal purposes, but just to decriminalize it altogether, to give people the right, if they want, to have access to that. So do you think maybe from a legal point of view, that's where a lot of these plants or medicines are potentially moving to? I mean, because again, it seems like there was a lot of stigma, a lot of propaganda against these things, but you know, maybe with the advent of internet and just information out there, that it's going to become more and more difficult to keep these things in the closet when there's just growing and growing evidence as to the medical use of these things.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I don't really have. It's almost like that. Nature's going to run its course. I mean, it's here in the state where I live. They just legalized marijuana not too long ago, and it's almost like there's huge lines to get to the dispensaries to buy it now. It's almost like it was always here, and everybody kind of there was a lot of cognitive dissonance among people that said it was so bad, especially given the fact that alcohol is so prevalent in our culture, and the effects of alcohol compared to the other plant medicines we're talking about are much more harmful on any number of levels. And yet that is all the prohibitions against that we talked about, that the government didn't want the spread of something harmful in society that might corrupt the youth. I mean, Exhibit A is alcohol, and you can, that's advertised all over the place. So where's the disconnect there? And it has to do with I'm sure profit motives and things like that. So, a lot of this is, you wonder about the profit motives with the pharmaceutical industry when they start losing some of their profits with their antidepressant medicine to other potential treatments that you've been talking about. So, yeah, you wonder.
And also that aspect of prohibition. I mean, it seems like we realize, at least for alcohol, that wasn't very effective, and the crime that was created from that was tremendous. And it seems like we still hold on to this idea that prohibition of other things is a good idea, but it does seem like more and more people are waking up to, I mean, just the devastation that causes. I mean, I think in the US we have the highest incarceration rate. A lot of that is drug related. things. It creates crime. It creates a black market. One has to essentially become a criminal to work with these things. Usually the quality degrades. And then I think something a lot of people don't think about is the international effects that those have. I mean, the drug cartels in Mexico, the sheer damage that the U.S. has created in places like Colombia. I mean, probably a lot of people don't know the history, but I mean, all of the violence that happened in Colombia came from drug prohibition, spraying, coca fields with deadly pesticides that then people drank and their children had deformations. I mean, obviously it seems like maybe some of these things came from a good intention of wanting to protect children, but like many things, we don't think about the downstream consequences, and probably through prohibition, just the astronomical harm, worse harm that's come because of that.
Mm. Yeah.
So I guess getting back to the legal thing. So maybe kind of to wrap this up, what do you think is a way forward, maybe in this religious context of beginning to potentially open this work in a legal way?
If to open things up to what? I mean, what is the end? What would you like to see?
Well,
like the more ayahuasca churches in the United States, or
I guess
what's the goal? Yeah.
Yeah, like I guess mainly in that setting, in a church setting, because it seems like there are precedences that have been set. So
Yeah.
maybe how do you see that moving forward, and legally, if that is to expand, what are things that would need to be implemented? Because I think I remember in the last time we talked, you said there was a church, I think it was the Native American church. You said some people tried using marijuana under the religious pretext, but it was turned down in court because it was shown there wasn't a tradition behind that.
Yeah, I think that might have been that case we were talking about before, where they were. It was more of a capitalistic enterprise. The court found it was more of a capitalistic enterprise than a church. But are going back to ayahuasca. I mean, there appears to be. It depends on how you want to open. I mean, a church. The UDV case would suggest that if you're having a church in ayahuasca, that there is already somewhat of a the actual legal structure. I don't know. Would have to be changed that much. I mean, I think it's more of a societal attitude about it, and perhaps the way of, that what's going on and, with all the research into, the various, into psilocybin and other things is probably going to have more of a beneficial effect in the long run than anything coming from the legal system. The legal system usually trails what's going on in society anyway. And it's kind of designed that way. I mean, it's the legislature, even though it's tough to change that, seems to be getting things done with the decriminalization efforts in various places, ahead of any legal prohibition, because the legal, it's very difficult to change sort of law, but it's easier to sort of change. If you're going to change policy, you have to win the hearts of people first.
Mm-hmm. So you had mentioned an interesting example about, so for example, I work with the Shipibo about creating a church that was based on Shipibo tradition.
Right.
Would that be more difficult? Because, for example, with Santo Daime and UDV, they tend to resemble what we would think of more traditionally as a church. I mean, for example,
Right.
in Santo Daime, you actually go into a church. I mean, they call it a church, and there's pictures of Jesus and Mary, and they often do it during the day, and they would drink ayahuasca and sing and dance, sing songs, often Christian songs. The way the Shipibo are working, it's just different. I mean, they tend to, I guess you could call it a church, but they may, in their terms, they would call it a maloka. It's often
Right.
a square round structure, which is also often a communal house. And they would go in that structure, and often usually at night, and they would drink their sacrament ayahuasca. But certainly it's religious, I think, by any definition of religion, and that's their sacrament, that's their tradition, that's their spirituality. Would it be more difficult because it doesn't necessarily resemble what we think of as a church?
I think it should be more difficult technically, because it's still the letter of the law talks about sincere religious practices, and there's probably no difference in the sincerity of the Shipibo tradition versus the Sanai Daime. In fact, the Shipibo tradition goes, predates the Sanai Daime tradition by thousands of years, probably. So that would be evidence that it's a sincere religious practice. It's been in play for thousands of years. It's part of the culture, part of their society. And just because it doesn't look like a Christian church shouldn't be relevant to the discussion that a judge is looking at. But practically speaking, of course, if it looks more like what a judge is used to seeing as a church, it would be, it would probably be easier. But that doesn't mean in the long run the legal argument is the same, and it shouldn't make a difference that it's not that it doesn't look, what's that saying? If it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, that kind of thing. So it should make a difference. It might, just given human prejudices, it might practically, but it shouldn't, because that really is not central to the question of it being a well-established, sincere religious practice.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, it would help. No, I just think that's what's missing. I mean, I think I told you before, part of the obstacle of this is people having to, you're only allowing people with money to, the people that can have the money to go down to Peru or Central America to participate. So it's somewhat exclusionary. It would be nice if you had availability that would be not based upon income or privilege, so to speak, and that was available on a more local basis. There's no reason why it can't. That's how religions spread. I mean, we have all kinds of, the United States is built upon a melting pot of different religious faiths, and I think you should add one more to it.
Do you think there would be any benefit? Because I would say most Shipibo are also Christian for various reasons. Do you think that would be beneficial, emphasizing that aspect, or that's kind of irrelevant?
It shouldn't be relevant. It wouldn't hurt, because you're dealing with people that don't know anything about how it would come into play is the judge would listen to the evidence, and if he's seeing pictures and it's like, oh, that's this looks more like a church as opposed to a maloka. Doesn't, as you mentioned before, does not look like what we think of a church. But when you get down to it, then you're compromising the religious belief just to fit into some pigeonhole here, which I don't know, that may or may not have a beneficial effect or not.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned before that the Shipibo might have been altering their practices a little bit at the Temple of the Way of Light, given the clientele that's coming in is different, and they've learned from us, and we've learned from them, or you've learned from them, obviously. So the cross-pollination probably never hurts anybody, but it should be relevant. It's but it wouldn't hurt, because it didn't hurt, for example, the UDB and the Sanai Daime churches, because they, in the court opinions, they specifically talked about the tie-in to Christianity there.
Well, cool, Michael. Anything else you want to add on the legal perspective?
No. Thank you very much for having me, and I wish you the best of luck. And I understand you're spending Sunday on your own form of lockdown in Peru. Sunday
right.
is the no going out day, which is good.
Yeah. I think one thing I'm going to try and do with these podcasts, I like this idea. It came up at the last I think the World Ayahuasca Conference. Is there was a question of what are the plants trying to teach us? So I'm curious from your perspective, what do you think the plants are trying to teach us or to point towards?
A higher state of human evolution in a way that we can't appreciate now, or at least I can't. I'm sure there's somebody, more who has had more and longer communication with them, with the plants, who have a better idea. But I see it pointing to something that's going to totally reshape our relationship with other people, what we think of as society, what we think of as life, what we think of as reality, into a new form that we can only sort of glimpse at now. We get glimpses because it's so different. It's like a vast uncharted territory that it's going to open up and allow us to go to, and we'll find that that there might be things already there waiting for us too, and cheering us on.
Yeah. Oh, great, Michael. I appreciate that. I really enjoyed this podcast. It's something a bit different than I've done, but it's something super important. So I really appreciate your take on that.
Oh, good. I definitely appreciate your work, Jason. And again, in my perfect world, in my universe, you're coming to North America and bringing some good stuff with you.
Yeah. Well, it's I think the climate is slowly but surely leading to that. So hopefully that may be in the cards in the coming years. So
good.
Yeah. Well, great, man. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to catching up again sometime soon. We'll have to think of another show.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jason.
Cool. Take care.
Yeah.
So that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the episode with Michael. The next episode, I'm going to be shooting with a friend of mine named Claude. Claude's been a longtime facilitator, guide with a lot of this plant work. He's originally from Peru, but he's lived all over the place. He's a really good guy, and I think a really good ambassador for this work as well. So that should be a really good episode. And as always, again, if you can hit the subscribe button on YouTube and go on Apple Podcasts, leave a starred rating and a short review, that would be a really big help. Thank you all who are supporting the show via donations, via direct donations or Patreon. If you're not a Patreon supporter and you could do that, that would be a really big help. There's a few different tiers where you can join and subscribe, anywhere from $1, $3, $7 an episode, and that really just helps to keep the show going. So I really appreciate that. For all of you who have done that, deeply appreciated. And that's it. Claude's on the next one, and then I'm going to be interviewing another lady who I work with, Marta. She's a yoga teacher. She's worked with plant medicine for a long time too. She should be really good. I'm also interviewing a psychotherapist, a lady who I worked with in ceremony, and she's done, I think recently, the MAPS psychedelic assisted therapy training. So that should be a really good episode. There's a lot of people coming on, so I actually might be putting out 2 episodes a week for the next couple weeks. So thank you guys so much, and I'll see you on the next episode.
Doom.